Uh, I think the presentations today open ground for kind of critical issues that yesterday we talked about. I would like to start with Hamad. One of the issues that we were talking before had to do about what type of entrepreneurship you can raise from this architect's energy, and somehow how the motivational speech that Nasser did and how that diversity of examples that was shown as a role of an architect can have an impact on a younger generation, and how you feel like being part of it.
Well, I'll try to answer that question, very well posed. I mean, in my experience, it's been really, like Nasser was saying, it's a matter of opportunities, and opportunities sometimes come in large-scale, well-paying projects, but often they come in small, not so well-paying projects, but they're nevertheless an opportunity, and every single one is a bit of marketing for yourself. It's a chance to test an idea, to test just your own sort of design boundaries. So for us in a practice, basically no job, I never say a job is too small. I mean, there is a certain threshold, but we operate on the scale of sort of furniture, on the scale of shops, and, well, not shops, but let's say a restaurant that's 20 square meters or 40 square meters, all the way to sort of large-scale developments, urban plans, everything. But each one has to have an opportunity to do something as a design. And so some of these get more diluted. The larger the project is, the more parties are involved, the more constraints that are there. And some, like the example I gave you yesterday, when a restaurant guy comes to you and he has a very small budget and he has a very simple idea and is fully trusting you in the beginning, let's say. You have this utter trust and you can do really anything you want, and it becomes a responsibility, because in the end you need to deliver to them as well. And slowly, that sort of trust, you start to gain that on larger projects, and sometimes the things that will lead to a larger project is not something that you did on your last big project, but something minimal, a detail, a moment that somebody recognized in something that could have been something quite small. So in that context, I think it's about, we are in this place where the competition we have in terms of design, I think, is at this stage. There's a lot of engineering offices, but there's very few design offices. So there's a lot of opportunities for a lot of people, and it's sort of a matter of taking those and doing what you can with them. And like I said, if I were to say anything to the guys out there, is that there's nothing too small in the beginning, and even later, that these things are quite inspiring and motivating in the practice.
Thank you. I will jump to Nasser, because I think Hamad just left the talk on a point that glues with your presentation and with Ivan kind of show of the Croatian case and how the architects build competition. So what I will ask you is, what's missing for you to go from that into building the opportunities for competitions for others, and for you, of course, but what's missing in all this to start launching competitions, to start opening these opportunities to a wider audience?
Actually, competitions do exist, although they're not existing in a sophisticated manner that we were talking about in the Zagreb University. And I think the reason beyond that, because of the lack of regulation. So the jurors they enter, they place this random point system that is so biased towards what they call the financial proposal versus what technical proposal. And I think Tariq is probably more equipped to talk about the difference with those and mostly these are not design competitions, the one probably they're more familiar with, but they're more tenders for the government project. Actually, the only time we have been involved in government competitions was once, which was actually for the courthouses that you guys won a few years back. And funny enough, in the competition, there was actually no mean to understand who's the jury, what are they going to actually look at, and what are they weighing off? Is it the financial? Is it the technical? Is it your ability to respond to the site correctly? And funny enough, one of the entries that were, I think, the second or the third, the project wasn't even on the site. It was on a different site. So in order for us to start as architects here, to begin to put together principles of how do you define what a new program is, what are the space allocations, what is the long-term vision of that particular building, whether it's a workplace or it's an urban intervention. I think our view of architects is always have been missing in these competitions. And if we begin to insert that view on paper and during the analysis, as they've done in the university project, definitely the opportunity will change. But what will change also, what we need to change is actually the jurors. Because right now there is, I don't know, 5, 6 jurors but you keep seeing in design competitions, and I'm not sure how equipped they are. And maybe they're, from the educational point of view, they do have proper architectural degrees, but I don't think they do know the means, or they have the means to judge competitions properly.
Thank you. Since you were talking with Tarek, that we can solve the situation of the competitions from once and we go to other topics. I think it's not good to go to Tarek, because Nasser was basically talking about equipment and how these people are equipped too. And do you think the idea that was talked yesterday about the society of architects could be a way to equip that decision making in terms of building a jury of a competition, building a program, defining a scope?
Well, I mean, currently I think the preparation of design competition versus the traditional governmental project competition, which is technical financial, they've started to actually add sometimes a design component to that. The preparation of the terms of reference for a design competition are, as Nasser said, they can be very vague, and which is sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing. But specifically, I think the jury part, as you mentioned, is somewhat lacking. Currently, they will normally ask for somebody from the end user client, somebody from Kuwait Engineering Society, and I underline engineering, and then they will ask for somebody from that particular ministry to be part of this. There was one competition which I was lucky enough to organize, which I think this gentleman here won a few years ago with Aziz Al-Ahmedi, whereby we were lucky to actually, it was more student run, and the competition was based with an international juror who had some credibility with the rest of the team, and that's what we need to expose our students to have critiques from various judges and jurors. But how to encourage more of it, I think it's approaching the clients. Now, at the end of the day, for us, quite frankly, a lot of competitions can be very expensive on any office. So I think there has to be a fair balance as to how do you create the right sort of competition at different levels where we can participate, whether it's even for a real project or it's just for a project that is never to be built. And that, I think, we could start through the university and with the architects that are available in Kuwait right now.
Thank you. I would jump now to Sulaiman, because I will not question you about this, but I know that you are perhaps well equipped about this topic. So that's the reason I'm asking you, what is the counterculture that basically can go into that and can kind of dismantle this and getting another type of intervention or another type of proposal that it's not so formal? You know, I'm talking about a more informal agency that can come also from an architect's energy, and we can see it in this team that is working for Venice. So how that can be done, because that is a line that is parallel and is running together with this.
I think it's it's more the younger generation working in government. That's how I see it, at least. It's what happened in Venice as well. It's sort of inspired individuals trying to make a change. It's very hard to make that change in these policies. But you can even see it in the competitions happening now at the Public Authority for Housing Welfare. The one you just won with BDP. There's a change in the percentage for, like, in technicalities, the percentage of evaluation that's based on the financial report, and it's shifting to more importance in sort of the presentation and the design of the project. And I think that, that stems from people being active and really trying to make a change, because there's an older generation in charge, and there's newer people with a newer understanding of, a better understanding of the role of architects and what to do.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, because I think you touch exactly the issue. So what's the ability when you know exactly the system, so you know the rules, so perhaps you are on the first line to break the rules. So you talked here about a young group, a generation group of architects that work for governmental institutions till 3 p.m. or till 4 p.m. and that after that time they can break the rules once they know it. So that was more my question to you, not about to know what you do before 3 p.m. but what you can do after 3 p.m.
Well, sorry. To that, on that point, to all of these points, I think there's also, in our case, with the gallery, it was sort of more the problem of you can't do anything before 3 p.m. or afterwards in the context where we were working. And, I didn't say it in talking about the gallery, but so there are 3 of us that curate this space called Pinkama. And for me, it gives me an opportunity as somebody that's sort of buried in this PhD work to have another platform where I can have certain conversations locally that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. But the other 2 are practicing architects. They're 2 out of 4 partners of an office called Over Under. And the motivation for them to start this gallery was essentially that they couldn't get work in Boston. At the same time that their office, they're designing the master plan and basically developing the rule set and implementing the rule set for the new central business district in Abu Dhabi. They're doing a lot of work in Guatemala. They're doing work quite heavily in every place where they're connected other than Boston, where you can basically not get a kitchen renovation. It's extremely difficult because it's a very conservative building town and it's very dominated by an older generation of practitioners. And so the idea of having a gallery, producing discourse, and trying to sort of enter the conversation in another way was completely a reaction to this problem of what happens when a younger generation of architects can't find opportunities for practice, and where you have to kind of introduce yourself into, or either generate a conversation that's not being had and make yourself central within that conversation. And it's led to certain kinds of repercussions. So on the issue of competitions, the biennial is a juried selection. So we set up a jury, we structured the process for this thing and decided there has to be a more formal way of recognizing good work by younger offices that's being produced. And now we're transferring it to the Boston Society of Architects, now that we're curating their space, that we're sort of teaching them, we're both transferring our jury selection and the people that we think are important onto them as a process that they can now use, but we're kind of training them in how to work with this generation of architects and sort of think within that culture as something that the Boston Society of Architects has been a professional, purely professional organization. They're not used to thinking in terms of the culture of architecture. And so our attitude is, if we can educate those institutions slowly by degrees and build the younger generation into it, that we can then pave opportunities to do our own work.
But I think that's one point, and that just tackles the issue of what can you do after, and it's connected also with the construction of opportunities. I wanted more to tackle this issue that how many people that are architects in Kuwait under 35 years old work for governmental institutions? Perhaps we are talking about a bigger percentage. And this is not the case in Boston.
Absolutely.
And this is very unique. So you are within the system. You work within the system. So when I'm talking about breaking the rules, I'm talking about a counterculture that has a huge potential of knowledge. And this, I think, it's exceptional. And this allows them a huge opportunity that go far from the recognition of sites for intervention. It's another type of opportunity. So I would go now to Aziz, mainly because we are perhaps talking, like,
Ivan in his presentation was talking about center and periphery, about this idea that only a metropolitan center can generate a certain critical view or representation of the real. And I wanted to talk to you about this. So how this can give ground for a critical representation of this reality. So we can talk about art, we can talk about everything that is beyond architecture.
Yeah, it's like, I think things are contagious. It's like after moving back from Zurich, and I grew up over there for a while, I realized that things are really implemented in a different manner, and it's more of experiencing it by touching or seeing it. So for example, in Switzerland, what we have, whenever we have a new building being built, we would have different models at the entry of the space and different set of materials that people would like start to touch it or like feel it, and then people would vote for that. So there's a larger interference between users and the competition. And when I came back here, I was stuck, and then I told myself I'm not going to stop by doing that. So I gave myself the first project by creating a project for myself and creating my atelier. And then I thought maybe by pushing the periphery of that, it could be a contagious thing for the neighborhood, and it did right now. It's the more I proceed to the neighbors, or the more I proceed to the neighbors or the clients, the more the neighborhood is transforming, and more projects are like reborning for me as a studio or as an urban fabric of Kuwait. But still, it's a small piece.
Okay, I think this issue of contamination, that was something I forgot to comment, because like the hygiene part is strong, but the way you ended your presentation with the contamination effect, it's something very strong also. And contamination and engagement is what we want to generate here. I don't know if you understood what I said, contamination. So because your presentation ended, you saying that your intervention in your atelier just had an impact in the whole neighborhood, and that people starting renovating. So this is what I want to say when I talk about contamination.
Yeah.
So I would like to hear some questions from the audience, and then we will go back here.
I wonder if, I'm just going to go back to this idea of terminologies about the local practice. I'll go back to contamination at the end of the comment. I realized that, Michael Kubo, you talked about the brutalist building, changing the terminology into heroic. And I wonder if this idea of the local is a problem of just a term problem, which leads my question to actually to Nasser. In your presentation, you showed most of the examples. You stressed the idea of the local, but most of the examples, or all of the examples you showed, they were at Colombia, Barcelona, and et cetera, et cetera. And you stressed the idea of your firm to be 50-50 Madrid, Kuwait, which leads me back to this idea that discussed by Sarah yesterday, that since the 50s and probably even before, we had this concept of 50-50, you know, the West and Kuwait. I don't know, I'm just wondering and questioning if the contemporary practice of Kuwait should still be 50-50. And if it's a good thing, it's a bad thing, if it's a completely different problem.
Thank you. We had a Portuguese guy that was the 5% man when the oil started here. Any more questions? Yeah, he had the 5% man. Any more questions? Come on. They need to answer more things, no? No one wants to raise more? So I go to Nasser.
Thanks for the question. I'm not sure if I do agree with the 50-50 analogy, because what used to be, or what still actually exists here as 50% international architect does the work from concept design to design development, and then the engineering is done here locally. That doesn't exist in our practice. Okay, for us, we're quite a unique firm because it was much easier for us to open an architectural studio in Europe where we could hire faster than we could hire here. We could work much more liberal than we could work here. And to open a studio, a parallel studio in Kuwait happened because of coincidence that we had sites. It wasn't because that same studio hopefully will be replicated in India, will be replicated elsewhere in the world in the near future. So it is a satellite studio what Kuwait is for us. But when we talk about local, it's being architects right now, you actually could work all over the world, and that's what we were discussing yesterday. But forget the physicality. It's actually about what the definition of local is. So what I mentioned yesterday, and I tried to mention here today, that there are a lot of opportunities for all of us in Kuwait, because a lot of us have studied abroad, or if you haven't studied abroad, you have teachers, especially the people in Kuwait University, who are educated abroad. A lot of you do travel, a lot of you do experience these nice public spaces, do experience good architecture, and I think we're at a point right now where we as a society, we should begin to design with our own hands. You're not importing a model from abroad. What you're importing is actually your skills, which is through your education, but you have to localize it because you're building in this society for this type of requirements and these types of needs and these types of users. So I think the definition of what I meant to be local is something that is different than at least the way I understood your question is. And definitely the examples that I showed are of projects elsewhere in the world, because all of these conditions were happening. So we all know, for example, Barcelona, before the Olympics in the 80s, it was a rundown city. Okay, and there were a group of architects, politicians, economists who came together and said, let's improve that city. And they've been improving it for the past 30 years. So we are at that pivotal moment. And I think if you look at examples similar to Colombia or Buenos Aires or the United States, or you look at them as just how they managed to do that transformation. So whether it's through competitions or through education or through neighborhood interventions or any of the projects that we are all dealing with, this is the way forward. And maybe contamination is a right way for me to end, because definitely there is a contamination effect that is happening in Kuwait. In certain areas better than others, but there is that level.
I want to go back to Sleman. Sorry. Now, just because the definition of local and locality of Nasser, I think it's quite different from what I expect from Sleman, for example, and what is being also, and now I'm talking, I don't know if I can do this, if I can talk to you as part of the team, because the work, as far as I got from your side, it's too much connected with the knowledge of the ground of Kuwait, and Nasser was talking about another type of knowledge. I'm talking more in a physical relation to the space, because that distance is something that I feel here. And of course we need every skills as architects, and not everybody needs to be on the ground, but how can you as an architect get closer to that scale?
Well, for me personally, I guess what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to do afterward, is just to understand, that as with Kethra, just to sort of understand how Kuwait works as a culture. And to me, that's how we can move forward, and that's how we can become more local. There's a tendency to reject in Kuwait, especially coming back from studying in that, or really just coming out of architecture school. You have these ideals in your head, and you come back, and they're all sort of broken when you come here. And there's an initial rejection to them. And I think there's an acceptance that needs to happen of the architectural condition here, the cultural condition, an understanding, a deeper understanding that needs to happen to sort of create really create the local and then take it further to what it needs to be.
I think another issue that was addressed here by Nasser, and yesterday someone questioned, it's the issue of the school and the university. And I think that when we are discussing about architects and what you will do, we need to stress this issue, because I think this is it's something that is critical here. And if yesterday we were talking about, with Tarek, about the impact of TAC in PACE and this vice versa, about the experience through the practice, and how US had that influence in the 70s, in the 80s. Today that influence is coming through education. It's not anymore coming through the practice. And I wanted to know from you, from the one that wants to answer this question, if you think that there is any quality out of it, is there any space to criticize that? Because I think this is a critical point. Really, I don't get how all these opportunities that Nasser talks about are not being explored at the university, and basically people there are doing things that don't have room here.
Well, I just wanted to maybe answer that question by saying that local, with the local term again, and that I feel that a constructive way to start to talk about the local is through simpler terms, the building code, the professional licensure, things that sound very boring, I know, but actually if we think about them in a way, a little bit like what Suleiman is saying, if we think about them as these exotic, exciting, cultural things as opposed to the boring professional realities, I think that can be a very productive conversation. And I say that as to frame my answer about education, because in the American system, there are no real competitions because education in a way doesn't feel obliged to prepare people to be architects. And I think that's my own criticism of American education. It's what Walter Gropius called producing artistic proletariat. I think it's the best term ever. And he described the Beaux-Arts Academy that way. And actually very literally saying, you are producing people to work for geniuses. You're not producing people to be geniuses. Well, of course, that's crazy, but you're also not producing people to just be practitioners. You're producing people to be working for the Grand Master who has been chosen in some weird, tricked way beforehand. So the American model has given up in a way that the practice teaches students to practice, which is a very strange condition, which is not the way that it was even in TAC, right? And the European system, until very recently, most countries was a polytechnic system where the idea was that you will learn some practice things and you might learn to think critically too, but the critical thinking will happen through other means, through parallel institutions. And the system of competitions, which is not, it's not a separate condition, it's part of the practice, relies on two things. One, the idea that you are prepared to do at least a schematic design, understanding some basic technical parameters. On the other hand, valuing you as a young person, which is the PON system or the Europon system, as a state. And we're talking about welfare states here, France, Kuwait, Germany in its own way, a state that decides that the value of young people and new ideas is also related to the education of young people and preparing them to understand the realities of building construction in Germany, which is different from building construction in France, and certain traditions. So maybe I'm being a little too pragmatic, but I think the idealistic and the pragmatic are actually much better bedfellows than people understand, and I do think it starts with education. And I do think a country has to decide and understand that there's models out there for which direction you want to go. Competitions without a very particular understanding of architectural education are meaningless. And the idea competition is very different from the professional competition, which doesn't mean that one is not about ideas and one is not about profession.
Thank you. I would go now to Hamid, because one of the topics that this raises is the issue about what's the relation between practice and education. And even if there is this US topic, and the US universities, they find a way to cap a relation between practice and school. And this is something that I'm not seeing at all at this university here, and it might be part of the issue we are here discussing. So how do you think basically the professionals that are really engaged on the production of architecture here could get closer to the school?
I mean, I went to American schools as well, but the undergraduate school I went to was just unique in that it was an art school. It was an art school, not a normally, you're in a normal college, liberal arts and all these kinds of things, and the architecture is the artsy part of the school. I was actually in an art school where everybody else, purple hair, painting, everything, and it was a very, very creative place. And the architecture, rather than being the most creative part in a normal school, was, let's call it, the most technical part of that school, but within this context. So again, it's still there. In terms of preparing you for practicing, in fact, I think the program I went to at the Rhode Island School of Design intentionally doesn't do that. We have one course in professional practice, and in fact, most of us found that once we got to the offices we were working in, that necessarily we weren't as good in CAD. We did not know about sort of generic building details of, sort of stud wall constructions or American building practices as much as sort of people from other 5-year colleges that happen within a larger university. But the opportunity was, and I asked this to our dean one time before I graduated, and he said, listen, you can learn how to work in an office and the conventions of an office and all these things in your years of experience that you're going to have working in an office. However, college, in his idea and in the way, is about sort of exploring ideas and really pushing that. And I mean, this has to also be done with a very scientific discipline. It's not just, okay, well, a very open-ended. No, it's very scientific, the way the studios are done, the way the supporting courses are done, the history, other disciplines within the art and architecture field, so that I don't necessarily think that it's about preparing people for professional practice. I think it's about giving them the discipline, letting them be inspired, so that when you do get to professional practice and these boring things like the municipality rules and where do I stick the sprinklers, or you can navigate and still create these opportunities despite all these things, because you're sort of coming from this design thought as opposed to sort of a practical thought, which you will develop no matter what, just by working. Now that brings up the second point, which is, at one point I was in the U.S. and when I got my 3 years experience over there, in order to be able to take the licensing exam, it's quite rigorous in terms of the different disciplines and all the different parts of an architectural practice, whether it be on the engineering, whether it be certain hours on site, certain hours doing quantity surveying. Now it's also a little bit boring, but you get a bigger breadth of knowledge. I moved back here after graduate school, and in fact the only requirement for me to set up my office was that I had 3 years as an engineer in any type of company that hires engineers, whether it be engineering, real estate, or other. Luckily, I motivated myself into preparing myself for this future because that I wanted to do that. But I think a lot of the offices that we compete with, not necessarily, on design, but in terms of work, and that dominate the market, are often run by people who didn't go through that experience necessarily. Maybe they had some other kinds of experiences. So I don't want to say that it's always the best way to have it this way, but that there is a certain sort of method of apprenticeship. There's a certain method of learning. There's a certain method of getting a certain amount of experience before you have that responsibility of dealing with people's, sometimes their livelihood.
I think this opens, I just want to do a last question to Tarek about this, just that we close this issue and then we can go to other, because Hamad just opened, I think, one slightly motive, that it's this idea of education through practice. And the traditional evolution of an association or a community of architects, it's the society or the chamber of architects. And basically that translation is made through the control of the practice after school. So I would say a decent internship, or basically a system that allows you to have the license. Do you think this would be also a motivation for this society of architects to come up, and also an argument to bring the architects from Kuwait closer
to the architectural companies, to the architectural offices in Kuwait? Because what I'm seeing is also a big distance between each other. Because one of the things we were talking before, like when we say that the majority of the architects under 35 years old work for governmental departments, might be because they find easier job there, or might be because they can't find job in the architectural offices. So I would like to question you about this.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of engaging younger architects with firms like ourselves, for sure. And I know in the past there has been quite a lot of attempt in establishing a society of architects separate from the engineering society, and that's been an ongoing battle for many years. But I'm very proud to see is that the Kuwait University has their own, architectural association. Now, by the mere fact that I think it was 1999, 2000, when we first established the Kuwait University School of Architecture, I can see the change when you're talking about the government organizations, when you're talking about counterculture, in a way having more trained architects as a totality within the system, not just, I think before that was mainly very few American trained architects, and I know that Kuwait University follows the NCARB accreditation, but to have them in the sort of governmental organizations where primarily before was all engineers. 1 out of 100 was perhaps an architect and perhaps trained in a different methodology, whether it's good or bad. So I can see the change of all these young architects in the government sector, and I don't think it's a bad thing at all. I think it helps open the minds of their bosses, and it's a tough battle and sometimes a wall to get things changed, but there is a change. On the other hand, I think perhaps we need to encourage architects who are graduating, who want to work in offices like ourselves, to be part of our teams in a more, I think we have to re-examine our working hours, our methodology of engaging with Kuwaiti architects or young Kuwaiti architects within our offices. I find that it would be great if we had, don't get this incorrectly or don't take this badly, but a lot more discipline within the architectural graduates that we have that can, take on board all these challenges. These challenges are going to happen. And I want the architects to have the patience to be able to take that on board and not lose their creative side, but in order to get something built that you love and aspire to have done, you're going to have to overcome these blockages. And they can be overcome, but you just sort of have to go through it with patience and be able to communicate in a very simple manner. And I think you mentioned about understanding the cultural aspect of it. Communicating with the culture within generations is also difficult. So it's something that you have to overcome. And we can do better, yes.
Thank you. I want to be, because we need to move topic, okay. Because I think there are, but you can be sure. It's great. It's just about the issue of the Society of Architects, and that for me, part of the issue is that they're not static or monolithic entities, and I would resist the assumption that simply the fact of kind of having or producing that kind of society automatically either will create a strong education in terms of practice or will benefit architects in particular ways. There is a Society of Architects in Boston. It's a branch of the American Institute of Architects, which is the national institution, and they're incredibly weak professional institutions for practice. They can't prevent architects from competing with each other on fees, for example, on projects and trying to undercut each other. They're legally prohibited from standardizing fees across the profession. It's an antitrust violation. All they can do essentially is provide you, if you call them up on the phone and you just need a standardized contract document, they can provide it. They can give you some guidelines, guidebooks for how to get through the licensing exams, but it's important to know that those things, educating you, for example, in what you need to get the license as an architect, is not educating you in how to practice. They're fundamentally different things. The education of practice is an extremely different problem, and it's, our approach to the Society of Architects in our dealing with them, we came to them with the attitude that they had only ever spoken purely to that professional audience in a very sort of technologized, technocratic, professional way, and that was neither productive for the architects nor capable of being an interface between architects and anybody else in society that might want to get a sense of what architects do, and by extension, what architects could do for them. And so we thought we can bring culture to the Boston Society of Architects and try to educate them in something like an architectural culture so that they can then be mediators between architects and other populations if they're no longer robust enough as institutions to have a strong relationship to practice. And so it's kind of practice, culture are sort of the two poles that if an institution can't situate itself effectively relative to one or the other, it's sort of nowhere.
But in relation to that, I doubt if here that weakness will be revealed, because we are talking about the center, and let's go back to the periphery. Like in Portugal, the best accomplishment you can have as an architect is to be the president of the Society of the Architects. In Croatia, it's exactly the same. On the other hand, the Society of Architects, it's basically the entity that lobbies in the government for the laws, for the codes, for all that thing, you know? So we are talking about a completely different role. So we are talking about institutions that have and operate in a completely different level. And I think Kuwait has ground for that. Yeah. So I would like to change the topic, because I think I would say mainly the presentation of Michael was very inspirational about this issue of what you can do as an architect beyond all these things we have been talking. And this is, I think this is the perfect issue to have some feedback from the audience, right?
I don't want to sound negative, but there's a slight danger, and I want to include myself in this definition, that I think architects have a very close relationship with academia, which is slightly worrying, because we tend to end up alienating ourselves from mainstream public and mainstream discourse. And pattern recognition, we tend to read the same books, we tend to wear the same clothes, we tend to talk in the same way. And we're sort of assuming that because we're sending a young generation of Kuwaitis out into the brave new world in the West, that they're going to come back energized. But they also come back with a sheep-like mentality. And as a relative stranger who's been in Kuwait for 2 months, it was scary seeing people as complete clones of people that I meet in Europe, not necessarily in the US. And I just want to urge people to think about site and context, because that's what we do as architects. We study site and context. I'm a cultural producer. I'm trained as an architect. I make films, I write books. But what I do is I do a site analysis first for my client, like an architect. And there is enormous richness to be found at studying the ground. That's what Ketra is. It's studying the local condition in the real sense. It's challenging my fellow Kuwaiti team to go to parts of this city that they've never visited before, and really opening them up to something that they even find astonishing. And I think, and I urge you, to really champion the Kuwaiti condition, whatever it is. Right now it's a void, it's undefined, but you're going to find all the energy that you need there. Thank you.
Since we are talking about educating the architect, there's also another side of education, which is education the people. How to educate the people about the architecture and to make it better. So I'm sure we all have great ideas, but a lot of times that you tell that client you want to do it, but then they say no because they don't understand. So how to spread the word, how to make, sometimes even with the governmental, you want to change it, but they stop us. And the architect community is a small community, but with the help of the citizens, I'm sure that we both can push them to bend the rules. How do you think we can spread the word? Thank you.
Any more questions? So, who wants to go on?
Actually, I'm on the other side. I'm actually more optimist versus a pessimist. And I'm an optimist because I think the opportunities do exist. And I think we all need a wake-up call. And the wake-up call is there. And unless we see it ourselves, no one is going to show it to us. And we're at a point in this architecture, in this society, where we're at a critical point of transformation, because for the past 50 or 60 years, we've been in a fast-forward machine, which is this machine that shifted us from a pre-oil to where we are today. And we barely have understood the culture, we barely had looked at our surroundings, we barely actually had the knowledge to assess our current situation. But I think we are at a point right now where we have higher number of educated people, better traveled, better read, more educated, and I think this group, which is part of the group which is sitting here, is the group that will make that transformation. And I do agree, because of you get clones, but you get clones all over the world. You get them because of Facebook, because of Twitter, because of all this social network. And okay, I might have, let's say, a semi-Kuwaiti American dialect, and somebody else might have a British Kuwaiti dialect, but that, okay, rubs onto us because where we're educated or where we're living. But that's not the most critical part. I think the most critical part is, how do you take that British accent or that Kuwaiti American accent and push it forward? Make it yours. Instead of just borrowing it, actually steal it and do something special about it. So I think there is an opportunity.
So we've talked about criticizing the discipline a little bit, and I think we've talked about the issue of criticizing not criticizing the public, maybe even you brought up a little bit, or not criticizing the public but being critical about the public. But I would say that the issues that we're raising are very serious issues for any country, because you can't really change professional structures without starting to talk about politics. And I would just ask, I would remind everyone here that professions in the history of at least the West, and that, so I'm being maybe somewhat superficial, but in the West, professions have been part of cultural change and political change. And it's interesting because a lot of times, because they were defending themselves, like engineers during the Enlightenment had a part in the French Revolution, not because they were even idealistic, but because they saw their own self-interest in certain political changes. And I'm going to put out a question, because I'm being a bad boy, which is that to challenge you to just ask you, do you see any political ramification in the things that we're talking about? Do you see political ramification in the idea even that knowledge is produced and not just delivered? Do you see political ramification in questioning the position of any discipline within a hierarchy, which is usually defined certainly by a consensus of some group of people? I mean, and that's maybe for anyone, even particularly the public, like, you know, the things that we're talking about, we're sort of, you know, there's different kinds of change, there's different rates of change, and I don't think there's fast change or slow change. We talked about the kind of radical change that the discovery of a certain resource occurred. We haven't talked about the change that a lot of other oil-rich countries are talking about in this last 2 days, the post-oil, or the post, not just the post-oil, but the post-wealth period of any country, because guess what? If we look at any history of any country, forget the West, forget the East, you know, there's times where things change. How do you adapt? How do professions, even in a way, have an autonomy to adapt without the country adapting always? So I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Carry the microphone. Is there anyone that wants to?
Answers from the public.
For me, as a student in Kuwait University, I think we're a little bit alienated from the real world, and we lack the practice in our school. So, and I think that most architects should take over the government sector to create the transformation and the change. But we tend to alienate ourselves again and work in the private sector. So that's what I think.
Hello. I think change is happening, and I think, as Nasser and everyone's saying, that now we're moving into a stage where there's more awareness and things like this, where conferences, workshops, different things that are happening, that not just engage in the discourse of architecture and Kuwait and how that affects what would happen in the future, but also keeps others aware of this issue, just like all of us sitting here. Some of us are not architects, and some of us are artists and business majors and whatever. But at this point, I think this is exactly our pivot point where, okay, yeah, there is a problem and we need to tackle it. And me being I'm still a student and I'm studying outside of Kuwait, but I think coming back, there's this, we should be optimistic and we should take responsibility for what's happening, especially with all this political and economical and all these changes that are happening at a fast rate. Maybe our rate could be slower, but there is going to be change, and I think it will happen with all of us, and I think this is a start of a good change that will happen.
Any more questions?
Talking about politics and architecture or cultural production in general, I feel, especially after 1990, after the war, it was a political decision by the government not to invest in art and culture. And it's slowly changing recently, but I think it was a decision, and you could feel it, that they don't want to invest in culture. And that was very different in the 60s, 70s, and even 80s. But I don't know why a country would do that. So I wanted just to ask, why do you think that happened in Kuwait, to any of the Kuwaiti speakers?
I just chime in a thought or two. I think, despite everything we've gone through as a country, you still have to also remember we're quite young. Institutions like museums and these types of things that are happening in Europe and the US, are built on a culture of endowment where families actually donate things. There is a value over there to having your name on a room of a museum, which is not quite there yet here. I was part of a project here, a master plan that included a theater project, and the idea was to get a signature architect and the name, names like Koolhaas and Zaha Hadid and everything. But there was still this underlying idea that this had to be a commercial venture, had to pay for itself and maybe even turn a profit, as opposed to something that has a boost in the beginning, but then slowly begins to sustain itself after it's able to educate itself. So it's not something I think that we can just turn on and tomorrow, we build all these things and we have a culture for them. I think, just because there's a museum there doesn't mean people are going to go to it. There has to be sort of this organic development. I don't think, I don't necessarily agree that putting 6 new museums like they've done in Doha or Abu Dhabi and these kinds of things is the way to go about it. And just in terms of development, I think in the Gulf, we've always been more organic than speculative. We've always been more driven by what we need, not what we think we may need in the future. So I think it's things like this. Galleries now, there's more galleries than there were 10 years ago. There's more exhibitions than there were 10 years ago. There's more people getting into that business of rugs and art and things. So these things are growing, I think, slowly. And we have to give ourselves time to evolve. Now, a big project like a museum or something like that, a cultural project, does tend to stimulate things as well and get things going. But I think you have to have the right platform to do that at the right time.
Sorry to interrupt you, but why do you think, why architects think always that culture is building?
Sorry?
Why architects feel always that culture is building?
It's not necessarily, yeah.
Yeah, because when you are rooming culture, you are talking about museums, you are talking about...
Well, in the sense, no, what I'm saying is this it's more about the culture of going out to do something other than eat, shop, something, like people here tonight, they're coming out just because they want... This is a concept that was there and then disappeared for a little while, I think, after the first war, but now it's developing again, and I think all of us, I mean, I can speak for Nasser and I, because we're, a lot of times we're in competitions together. There are sometimes public things, sometimes there are private things, development things. 10 years ago, maybe, those same companies would not have gone to young design architects. They would go to the more established, long history architects. So there is this change, but we're still young. And every year, there's more people. I mean, just like Tarek was saying, the architecture school was established 10 years ago. So what is done in 10 years is pretty fantastic, I have to say. It's definitely still not what it is in certain places, but they had 200 years on us. Now, things are moving faster. The rate of acceleration for these things is faster. But I think, the idea is to just keep optimistic and keep coming to these things and keep participating in any competition, whether it be government or anything, get involved and put ideas out there and everything. And going back to contamination, these things do spread quite quickly. I mean, you do one good project here, you're gonna have sort of a barrage of people coming to you to do something similar. And sometimes it's localized in an area. So, sometimes we'll do a small intervention, then all of a sudden these other things will start to do it. So that's the opportunity we have here, that, someone in New York or in Boston, where they have this intense competition, a small number of opportunities, it's I think here we're in the opposite. We sort of almost have a bit of a vacuum, so you have to take them. Now, it's not the same conditions as over there and over here, and you may get abused once or twice, but I think there's hope for it. So I am optimistic as well, or else I don't think we'd be here.
I just want to comment. You said something very important. You said we alienate ourselves, and you were asking how we can make people understand. I think a better question is, how can you understand the people, right? I mean, it's sort of, there's this way of thinking that we come in, even just out of school, and we're this all-knowing person. How can we educate everyone on what we do? How can you educate yourself on what people want and why they want it? I mean, there's one thing I learned from Aziz and Mira. That's missing in Kuwait is this love and appreciation of the tackiness that we have. I mean, there's a culture of tacky, whether it's in, something like Lemset Fen or the Ramadan dramas. There's something that needs to be understood. What makes those work? What makes those popular? I think that's even something small like that can push it forward. You understand them so that you know how you can change, how they can understand.
I think that's also a question of how you are available too. Like how architects are available to think in more things rather than building. And I think this is a question tonight. And I would like just to end this with the last topic, because I think it's decisive. It's something Ivan just started talking about. And for someone that is outside Kuwait, we hear this a lot around Kuwait, but never in Kuwait. And if the oil runs out, what's going to happen? Because basically we are talking about architects, and architects are basically educated to build. Here we are in a country where you demolish quite often, and I never saw any architect getting any knowledge on how do you demolish. Because when you demolish, you are producing a resource. Because let's go back to Colonel Amps in '53 when he came here, and he basically defined two things. In Kuwait, you don't have resources to build. You need to import everything. To import, you need money, right? On the other hand, Colonel Amps was saying also that the government of Kuwait is raising $60 million every year, and they will spend it all in buildings, are we expecting too. So if you don't have the 50 billion, would be the number today perhaps, how do you will make it? On the other hand, it's also very interesting that all the culture around here of wealth distribution is connected with building, generally. The translation is too much affected to building. If we see the famous 75 plan in Saudi Arabia, the development plan, out of 100, I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think it's out of $170 billion, $90 billion were dedicated to construction, to build. So we are talking about... This was in Iraq, where a lot of foreign architects first started coming into the region and working in the 1950s. The Iraq Development Board was founded in 1951, and it was founded to spend 70% of the nation's oil revenue on modernization projects through a series of 5-year plans. And so the first 5-year plan was largely infrastructure. The second 5-year plan was cultural institutions and architecture, and that's when they invited Le Corbusier, Alto, Gropius, Sert, Gioponti, Dudok, all of these guys, right? And so it's, you know, yes, just the numbers.
And this is interesting also because Ivan was saying that they did a competition for the new campus of Zagreb without money, right? We're used to that. This is something that wouldn't happen. This is something that happened in the 20th century. Our generation has an excessive agency that was not there before, and I think that's kind of a culture issue that was produced. On the other hand, I just remember my country because we had our oil when we got in European Union, right? We were getting lots of money, so funding was for us the gift. So everything was applying to fund. And now we have a debt that it's around 170% of our gross GDP, basically. So, and now we really don't have money, neither to build, neither to pay what we built. So I would like to ask you about Sabia. So what will be Sabia then?
What will it be, or if they're going to do it, or, well, I mean, I don't know. That's a good question. I think it's, if you don't already know, it's a city for 250,000 people. But as the infrastructure related to that is going to be quite huge. And I think the basic argument behind it is with the construction of Bobian port, which is ongoing, and by 2020 will be a fully fledged port plus ancillary services, etc. There may be a need, which will be an economic driver for that city, whether it's going to be as large as they want it to be. I think it could be quite challenging. As I mentioned to you yesterday, there's a Bronze Age village there, and there's a petrified forest out of fossil stones. There's a lot of important sites. Are we going to annihilate that and ruin some of the Mutla Ridge? I don't know. The infrastructure to get there, there's a $500 million bridge to get there. There's already Subia Highway, which is connected. Before we start working on projects like that, shouldn't we concentrate on actually giving proper housing to people who are still living in one of the wealthiest countries in the world in a 4x4 or 5x5 meter Chinku house in Jahra? When we're building a city like that, let's concentrate on building those housing for those people first. If you drive along the highway, it's atrocious. I think you went up north today, you might have seen that. That's not what I think our country should accommodate, those kind of, as they call it, ashwaiya or something like this. So that's where we should start, not with Subia, wild dreams, okay, it looks like the future. I think it's a remnant of our ideal pre-bust Dubai kind of, we were aspiring to be the shiny kind of new city and compete with that. So we should start with the basics and not dream too much first. So that's my 2 cents.
With respect to the project in Sabia, I mean, I sort of agree. I look around downtown, and half of downtown is still, empty plots of land. So I think, just the same thing about that new project. I don't think Kuwait is Dubai. I don't think it should ever be that way. And we still have a downtown that's there, that's underdeveloped, that needs some work, and it has some amazing things about it that are pretty difficult to construct from scratch in a new context. I mean, even the remnants, lots of remnants that are put up together, but there's something there that's worth keeping. And again, the locality, the physical location of it, as opposed to this idea of an island that's going to solve problems. I think that's avoiding the problem more than it is trying to really jump into it.
I agree. I think there is a jump, a disconnect. It's not really sort of the question of need that's being answered in the city. Our center is creeping out, and we're ignoring it. I think in the future Hawali and Jabriya will merge into a new center, and then, you know, there's a natural way to do it, and this seems unnatural in a way, sort of something to put so far away. Perhaps there are other reasons for it, I'm not sure.
That topic, I just remember always something that comes in my mind is that in these discussions, everybody is just talking about Kuwait City, like the country is bigger. And when I even launched the issue of Sabiha, I don't want to be so specific about Sabiha. I want to talk about the chalets, I want to talk about Khiran, about Wafra farms, about the 9% and the 91% or whatever percentage is, about what is this territory, how you will live on it. Because when we are talking about resources, we are also I don't know, but one of the most exciting things of our generation, our 21st century is the capacity we have to produce material. I think that's like very powerful, and in a place like this that requires some level of artificial conception for human survivance, this is a topic that needs to be stressed. Today we were there in Sabiha and we went outside and we were just thinking how these guys could walk here. We are just in this last round, and then we go back there about this idea of if we can't build, what we will do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree on that, and seeing it from a different scale is quite dangerous. Looking back at Kuwait City, there's a lot of problems that needs to be reconsidered rather than investing in another place, and it's quite still early. I mean, around a lot of our areas, there's a lot of high-rise building which is completely uninhabited, and it's like Kuwait City has a lot of small pockets that need to have interventions in order for a city to operate. So there's a lot of work to be done.
So renovation is the key. If you don't get projects, but renovation applies also to build. You need money also. You need.
Yeah. But I mean, I think architects, even if there's, know that should be involved in a lot more building work, but at the same time, I believe architects are also problem solvers in general. So I don't know what we're aspiring towards, a different, let's say, after post-building. But I think as architects, I think we're able to see problem solving and work through issues perhaps differently than other professions, perhaps. I don't know, maybe that's, I don't know what profession would be that we'd help with, but there is that education of architecture would still help you, I think, in whichever field you actually end up choosing.
Yeah, that's actually a topic that I think was not spoken today here, is like Hamad was talking about, in the old times the architect would be the head of the municipality. And I think this political role, like now we see a lot in Europe, like basically mayors that are architects. And I think this idea of the architect as a negotiator, it's something that is quite fascinating, mainly here, and mainly with the people that have all this background with the governmental institutions. No, Michael? Or it's everybody already sleeping? Someone has something to say? Or we should end here? And I just say that on the 29th.
Recently, there are really good projects happening in Kuwait, and the result will mostly in 5 years, like we will see them. But the problem is 90% of the design are made by non-Kuwaitis. Why aren't we encouraging Kuwaiti architects doing these projects? And there are amazing like opportunities.
Are there any more questions from the audience?
My comment is not exactly exclusively architectural, but maybe it's relevant and you guys could tell me what you think. It comes back to the point about, let's say, not encouraging culture or not having this culture of the importance of art in Kuwait. And I think one, I don't know if I agree with that 100%, and two, you could question what is culture, what is art, how is it valued, all of that kind of stuff. But more practically, if we're going to make comparisons to like other countries where, for example, people give their art to museums, I think we shouldn't romanticize the kind of valuation of art and culture in other places, because one thing, art is big business, it's millions and millions, and we all know that. And the other thing is, culture is something that's created in a lot of different ways. So the culture of giving art to museums is philanthropic in a sense, yeah, but it's also in some countries like the US and France, it's a way to get out of an estate tax, right? It's like you have a lot of money, you want to get a break from the government, you give your art to museums. So it teaches people to give back, and it's also kind of rewarding in a, let's say, moral or emotional way, but it's also practically a smart way to go about doing things and dealing with your money. So in that sense, I guess my question is, in Kuwait and dealing with architectural challenges, how does like the law and building codes and the municipality influence the situation we see? And how do, let's say, architects in general, but also in private practice, deal with these laws and building codes? And is there like an architectural lobby in Kuwait? I mean, there's so many interesting ideas, interesting people and theories, but how do we actually get those theories to have a practical application and kind of encourage people, or force them in a way, to do what needs to be done?
More questions? Or should we answer to if there is any architects lobby, if you can buy art and put it in museums?
Well, I totally agree, and that the word culture, I have the sense that we're throwing around the word culture rather loosely, and it's been used to completely opposite ends in various comments in the discussion. And as you say, right, the issue of museums and art and the economy of that thing, you know, that's culture industry, as it was called, not, you know, culture is something different. And the issue of sort of how does it get produced, or how do we engage with it, you know, I totally agree with the comments that have been made about, you know, you do it on the ground. It's culture is out there, and it's a question of what are the mechanisms by which architects and people from other disciplines collectively access and learn about and come to understand what is out there, and then what that means in terms of building practice, then how one builds for the way in which people live, the things they want, etc., and that sets a lot of questions about then what are the mechanisms, what are the instruments by which that happens, and then what is the role of institutions. For example, then legal and building codes take on a very particular agency, and institutions, professional organizations of architects, I can imagine then there's a very specific role of allowing architects to interface or develop a very deep knowledge of legal codes, building codes, etc., as one of the critical instruments by which one can access or have some ability to engage with conditions that one might be interested in, for example, right? So there's the kind of administrative aspect of conditions that one might be interested in on other grounds, etc., right? And I think it is important to talk about, to figure out what we mean when we talk about culture, essentially. And I'm glad that you raised the question that culture, if we think of culture as museums and a kind of intellectualized production of something which then has to be sold to a public that is seen to stand outside of it, then the game is over before it begins, essentially.
Also, there's an issue that we keep raising that I think people have politely responded to, but not directly, which is the issue of, is there enough Kuwaiti architects? Is it better for a Kuwaiti architect to do architectural projects in Kuwait, or a foreign architect to do Kuwait? I think these things have been sort of distributed, and most of the architects, or all of the architects here, have been trained, I mean all the Kuwaiti architects here have been trained somewhere else. And in some ways we've heard different responses to what that meant when they returned to Kuwait, and how they perceived it in very different ways. So I think it's very, I find it very, I'll cut to the chase, I find it very problematic as someone who's also from a small country that gets very xenophobic, and all countries are xenophobic. Small countries tend to be more xenophobic. And I'm making that blanket statement as a small country person who sometimes is xenophobic. That we have to be very careful and find mechanisms to look closely without then becoming exceptionalists, without becoming chauvinists, which happens really fast. And I think that's where, in Croatia, during this little peripheral moment, there was some very smart people who understood that as a problem and were tried to balance the two. And they tried to think about not so much giving Croatian architects work, but educating Croatian architects in a way that was local and global, and educating them there. It's true, that was a difference. Like they were sending people off to primarily to the Berlage, like literally the entire country went to the Berlage Institute in the 90s, and there was good and bad things about that. And most of the people that were doing interesting things in the last 10 years were seemingly local architects, but if you looked under the history of it, it's really not true. So there are specific issues, but I do hear, and I don't mean to be critical about anyone's comments, but everyone needs to be a little bit critical about the idea of a Kuwaiti architect. And I think we all are being critical about it, but there's a lot more to think about. And the idea that people have ideas to impose in the world, as opposed to understanding how ideas are produced, which is, I think, a lot of comments have been made in a very positive way about how ideas are actually produced in the world and how not ideas are imposed in the world from the Kuwaiti or the American, the expert, or the creative layperson. We either celebrate too much kitsch or we celebrate too much high art, and both of those are dangerous roads to go. So I just think it's something that and this is the reason to have these kinds of conversations, and it is a reason to start to define the terms a little bit more specifically so we can be more free with them, actually.
And I think just to close the loop on that, and in a way, the discussion both today and yesterday, I think that's directly related to this issue of what constitutes culture. In other words, what is seen to be valuable in our evaluation of the physical environment, the social environment, etc. And it relates to the comment that I think was an absolutely correct comment that Kuwait is not Dubai. Kuwait has layers and remnants and traces that go back over a longer history and that are still there and can still be worked with. And on the simplest level, it might just be because Kuwait developed out of oil revenue in the 50s, whereas Dubai started in the 90s. It's just there's a kind of longer time period in which certain kinds of physical products and practices were produced that had these kinds of relationships, but also built products, some of which we talked about, the Souk al-Manakh, these kinds of things yesterday, that come out of all of these transactions. And I would argue that those things are culture. They constitute building culture, practice culture, social culture, cultures of use, the ways in which those things were then appropriated, etc. Kitsch, Kunst, etc. The whole right. That is culture, and there is quite a lot of it. And I would say that is the ground on which all of these issues should be made, rather than, as you say, what ends up being a completely a totally arbitrary distinction between the local and the non-local.
That's the reason why we are here.
Yeah.
I think one of the... Okay, to be, again, positive about this point, I think we should build our own credibility. Because as architects, we always like to sell ideas, and these ideas normally are on paper and they look glamorous probably, but doesn't mean that it's actually built well, detailed well, thought out extremely well, looked at the program, challenged the program, looked at the end users. And I think us being a young society, let's say when the big firms here in Kuwait like Pace and others started, okay, at that time they were building, I don't know, hundreds of buildings a year or throughout their young history, and this is why they needed foreign expertise and they needed actually more manpower to help them. I'm assuming, and I think that's part of why at that age these things actually happen. But today, with having all of you here and having all of us here, I think we definitely could take up the challenge. But to take up the challenge isn't just conceptualizing a good idea, because that good idea isn't good enough to be built yet. Unless you know how to detail it, unless you understand it, unless you test it, unless you understand its resilience after many years. And this is why the Kuwait Fund is a good example. Okay, it's one of TAC's most successful buildings. But if you look at their other buildings, it doesn't mean all the buildings that they built here or elsewhere in the world are to that level. Maybe they had the right client. Tariq, you probably know the history more. You had definitely the right client at that time. You definitely had the right funds at that time. Urbanistically, the site sat by itself, but how does it engage to the rest of the city? It doesn't, because it's a freestanding building, which is unfortunate. And if you look at the Chamber of Commerce across the street, again, it sits as an island, has no clue with or no relationship with what happens around it. And I think we are at an opportunity right now to look at everything that is in between here in the city, and we as architects should start to propose what should happen. And when I was trying to present earlier on opportunities, I think we seek these opportunities. Don't wait for a client to come to you to propose a project. I think you should start to propose projects. And I think by us lobbying the government or lobbying the private sector, or as simple as Hamid was talking about neighborhood interventions, Shueikh, which is not far away from here, Shueikh residential neighborhood, if you go see, people are actually developing covers around garbage containers or waste collectors. And it's funny enough, each family is doing their own intervention of one. Something so simple. Imagine actually you do it in your own neighborhood, and you begin to, even if you sell it to your neighbor's home, that by itself will change the street. If you decide to pave your sidewalk correctly, okay, that again will change the street itself. So you have to generate your own projects. I'm actually of the other end. I don't think we should wait for clients, because they won't come to us unless they see us. They see our credibility.
Or wait for institutions, or wait for governmental institutions.
Yeah, and the government won't come to you, because who are you? What have you built? What is your expertise? And they look at more established firms, or actually more foreign firms that has done a hospital before. Okay, is that a good hospital or a bad hospital? They don't even have the expertise to measure. They say, okay, this firm is in this famous ENR ranking, this engineering society ranking. It has X amount of employees, and it has also X amount of revenue. We will invite them. What have they done? I don't know if you guys know, but Sheikh Jaber's hospital is designed by a firm called Lang & Wilson. Has any of you even heard of Lang & Wilson before Sheikh Jaber's hospital? Has anyone studied Lang & Wilson? Why have they been invited? I think we should ask ourselves.
Thank you. I think the weather conditions, the climate conditions are making it to the end. I want to thank you, everybody. I hope we could be successful in this thing of finding like a common ground between that side and this side. Also, one of our aims was also to test this, how Douaniya can be an effective typology in this type of discussions, and I think further discussions here should use this format. And I really would like to thank you all, and would like to thank our guests that came here, and I hope really that they got closer to you and you to them, because that's the aim of this. Thank you very much, and good night.